Genres in literature are generally divided into two different groups: nonfiction and fiction. Nonfiction being based in reality, and fiction being based in fantasy or make believe. We'll start with the different genres of nonfiction. Narrative nonfiction is information based on the fact that it's presented in a format told as a story. So it would be real life facts, person, place, things, stories that truly took place, but are told in a story format instead of um, in a speech or an essay form. Essays are short literary composition that reflect an author's outlook or point. Short literary compositions are usually theme based, and the subject is usually done in a prose or analytical spectacle, or interpretive of a certain subject. So you'll get a lot of opinions, a lot of facts that may be skewed more towards the writer's opinions and biases. An autobiography is the life account written of a person by that person. So, truth things that happened within that person's life through their own telling. Where, of course, we know that a biography can be written by anybody about anybody. So it would be true facts, true stories, true things that have happened to a person, but told through another's view. And then when we move on to fiction, there are also several different genres within fiction, more so than just regular nonfiction. Drama is a genre of literature that's subject for compositions in a dramatic form. It's generally written to be put on as a play or as to be told through interpreted dance. Sometimes a lot of dramas are performed as ballets or different interpretive dances. There's a lot of conflict and a lot of emotion because those are things that are easily conveyed in a dramatic stage production, whether it be dance or acting. Poetry is verse and rhythmic writing with an imagery. Generally, poetry makes us feel and think of certain images that the poet wants us to. Generally, it will have a feeling or a theme behind it, something that the author is trying to portray or make us feel. Fantasy is the forming of a mental image with strange or otherworldly settings. So when we talk about fantasy literature, there are different types. What comes to a lot of people's mind would be a Lord of the Rings type book, something where you have characters who are not human or not fully human, places and times that don't exist within our own. For different forms within fantasy, you get high fantasy and sometimes a contemporary fantasy, which can be set in our world, but across and barriers, things like that. Things very foreign concepts to us. Humor in literature is faculty of perceiving what is amusing or comical. Generally, they're stories that are told in a fun, fancy, exciting way. A lot of children's books are written with a lot of humor and a lot of tongue-in-cheek. The characters do things not so much necessarily to move the plot along, but to make us laugh and find entertainment within the book. While these pieces are generally plot-based, a lot of the actions don't necessarily have to work to move that plot along. A fable is a story about a supernatural, extraordinary people, usually in the form of a narration that demonstrates truth. Fables about animals speaking, humans that have superpowers. A lot of time, the best example of a fable would be what we're all used to, the Aesop's fable. And in that, stories are told using animals to teach us lessons and about how we should act with each other and in certain situations. So generally, fables will teach us lessons using outrageous storylines. Fairy tales or wonder tales are a kind of folk tale or fable. Sometimes the stories are about fairies or magical creatures, usually for children. They kind of can, and a lot of genres will start overlapping into each other. Sometimes it's very hard to pick out a genre of a book that you're reading just because there are so many elements that might overlap into other. Uh, and with fairy tales, that's another one of those things where you may have outrageous characters that don't exist, times and places that don't exist, but generally these have a very happy ending. There's lessons learned within them. A lot of children's stories are based on fairy tales. It's actually amazing to see how many books are based on fairy tales that we never even realize. Science fiction is a story based on impact and potential science, either actual or imagined. So science fiction is one of those genres of literature that is set in the future, on other planets. Technology is advanced. Anything goes with science fiction. You can have the most outrageous technology because it's set way in the future, and why not? A lot of people think science fiction would need to take place in space. Not necessarily. A lot of science fiction will take place on our own home planet, but only taking it into the future where other things have happened. Right now, very popular is dystopias, which some will say is another genre unto its own, and genres are very much open for interpretation. Some genres people don't agree are actual genres. Other people think that should be more included. So this is just kind of an overview of general genres that people think of, basic genres within literature. But know that there are a lot more out there, and then some of these are also up for debate. Short story is a fiction with such briefness that it's not able to hold a subplot. So a lot of short stories do not get published because nobody wants to buy a book that has 20 pages in it. Short stories are generally very one base plot driven. There's no subplots. There's very few sub-characters within it because the story itself cannot maintain those. It's very to the point. Most of them have few characters, and most of the action happens right off the bat, if there is any at all. So short stories, again, not something you're going to get published unless you put them in volumes. Short stories are excellent for magazines. Will buy short stories. Not something that you will find unless you find a collection of them within bookstores. Although a lot of self-publishing sites like Amazon are making them much more accessible to people. You just have to kind of take a look at how many pages of something. Generally, you're not going to see short stories over 50 pages, or their word counts are very low. Realistic fiction is a story that can actually happen and is true to place and time. This a very popular form. A lot of here and now contemporary fictions are realistic things. So a lot of romances, they're not set in foreign times or foreign places. They're set in the here and now, with tangible things that we can relate to. Folklore are songs, stories, myths, and proverbs of a person of folk that was handed down word of mouth. Folklore is a genre of literature that is widely held but false and based on unsubstantial beliefs. So a lot of folklore those are going to be your traditional myths. So people who are part of tribes are cultural myths. These are things that are held true. Maybe nowadays we know they're not necessarily true. We know now, we have our own theories on creation, but most of these particular groups have their own folklore on how the earth became what it is today, how animals are the way they are. And these are entertaining, generally based out of, once held beliefs of traditional people. Historical fiction is fiction with characters and events that are true to a time period. So there's stories that for us in 2014 could be set back in the 1900s, but with fictional characters, fictional events. Or they can take place around a particular event with fictional characters. Titanic is an excellent, and it's a movie, not so much a book, but that's an excellent example of a historical fiction. It's a real event, real place and time, but obviously the characters were not necessarily true to that story. Horror is an overwhelming and painful feeling caused by literature that is frightfully shocking, terrifying, or revolting. Fiction in which events evoke a feeling of dread in both the characters and the reader. So obviously we think horror, we think Stephen King. These are suspenseful, not necessarily suspenseful in the way that a thriller would be with spies. These are very much shock, suspenseful, and terrifying books. They are designed to elicit fear. A lot of times these books are fear of unknown. Back in, if you look at some that were written in the 40s and 50s, there was this large fear of aliens and pod people and a lot of those things, and again, that's one of those things where the genres will cross over. So you'll see, a little bit of science fiction in there, but you have a huge horror base of what these things may do, what they look like. A lot of those stories are designed to incite fear in the reader. Tall tales are humorous stories with blatant exaggerations, swaggering heroes who do impossible things. So the best example would be Paul Bunyan and his Blue Ox. Things that can't possibly ever take place. We know, this isn't a matter of we believe this is what happened. These are simply entertaining things that we know could never take place. The Johnny Appleseed type things. A legend is a story that sometimes of a national or folk hero. Legend is based on fact, but also includes imaginative material. A lot of historical events and figures get blown out of proportion. So we take, for example, President Washington chopping down the cherry tree. There's nothing to prove that he actually did it, and it may have been founded in an actual truth at some point, but it gets told and told and retold until we have a legend born out of a truth. So something that didn't take place but is enhanced to be entertaining. Mystery is a genre of fiction that deals with solutions of crime or unraveling of secrets, anything that is kept secret or remains unexplained or unknown. So a lot of mystery writers out of there, a huge genre, huge selling market for a lot of authors. Very few of us out there have not read a mystery of some sort. A lot of times we think mystery, we think crime-based, which could be, but there's also different types of mysteries that may not be based necessarily in a cop situation. Sherlock Holmes, where the whole point of the novel is almost a whodunit, figuring out what the crime, who caused the crime, and why. Mythology is a type of legend or traditional narrative. This is often based in part on historical events that reveals human behavior and national phenomena. Symbolism also usually has something to do with the gods, goddesses, a body of myth of a particular people. So obviously mythology, most people immediately go to Greek mythology, which would be a good definition of it. They are rooted in real events. We know there really was wars going on at that point in time with those particular people. However, how much of that, obviously we have no real account of Odysseus making that long journey, or what truly caused a lot of those wars. It may not necessarily have been Helen and her beautiful face that launched all the ships. Obviously, Greek and Roman mythology very big on gods and goddesses, and using them to define the meaning of things, from thunder and lightning to earthquakes. It was a way a group of people explained the unknown, and it became a base of stories, and which was retold and retold and retold, and a lot of things based off of those particular tales. Fiction in verse is a full-length novel with plot, subplot, themes, majors, and minor characters. Fiction in verse is one of the genres of literature in which a narrative is usually presented in blank verse form. So when we think of fiction in verse, it's usually told in first person. It will go continually through the story. You'll have major and minor characters. You'll also have subplots within a main plot. So you will have your main plot carrying through the story with your subplot within your sub-characters and the main characters taking up a good many of those pages. Again, usually told in first person, but can be told in a second person or an omnipotent view. The genre of fiction itself can be defined as narrative literature. Works which contain a product of the imagination is not necessarily based in fact, and fiction sometimes is feigned, invented, or imagined. It's a made-up story. Unlike nonfiction, in which are rooted in truth, you will not find nonfiction that has fiction within it. Anything that has any non-truths in it is automatically considered fiction at that point. There are several other different genres that you can get into. There are different subgenres that you can get into. Even breaking down science fiction can be broken down into further. Horror can be broken down further. This is a brief overview of what is considered the main branches of fiction and nonfiction. You can get into and breaking down fantasy. There's also junior fiction for children. You can break things down into age groups. If you ever go into any of your libraries and just take a look at how those books are broken down, you'll see that you can break groups down into more and more smaller groups within it. So you may find that you can go into the young adult, and that young adult is broken down into fantasy, and that fantasy is broken down into high fantasy and paranormal and contemporary. So you can continue to break these groups down into subgenres and more subgenres. The important thing is that you understand what makes the main groups up, so that you can better understand what you may find interests you, and not limit yourself to, just reading historical. There are several different forms of historical. If you like science fiction, you can break it down into space operas and different genres that come out of there. So just next time you're in the bookstore, take a look around and see what genres that you can point out, and then look at those subgenres within it. And you may find that if you like mystery, there's an even more specific group that you may find even more books that you enjoy.